Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. I'm Jonathan Capehart, associate editor at the Washington Post. President Biden has been in France commemorating the 80th anniversary of D-Day, where his speech in Normandy yesterday repeatedly compared the fight against tyranny and authoritarianism during World War II to today's global climate. Joining me now, Washington Post White House reporter Tyler Hager. Tyler, welcome back to First Look.
Thanks for having me. Good morning.
Good morning. So let's listen to some of President Biden's remarks in Normandy yesterday. Listen.
Make no mistake, the autocrats of the world are watching closely to see what happens in Ukraine, to see if we let this illegal aggression go unchecked. We cannot let that happen. To surrender to bullies, to bow down to dictators is simply unthinkable. We're living in a time when democracy is more at risk across the world than any point since the end of World War II, since these beaches were stormed in 1944. Now we have to ask ourselves, will we stand against tyranny, against evil, against crushing brutality of the iron fist? Will we stand for freedom? Will we defend democracy? Will we stand together? My answer is yes, and only can be yes.
And so, Tyler, a couple questions. One, what was the president trying to accomplish with his speech yesterday? But also, he talked directly about the invasion of Ukraine, but was he also talking sort of obliquely, if that's the right word? I'm not sure. It's way early in the morning, talking about Donald Trump and domestic pressures on democracy at home.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there were two goals for this trip, and we're going to see even more, I think, explicit references to Donald Trump, maybe not by name, but it'll be clear later today when the president goes back, or he's on his way now back to Normandy to give another speech that I think we will see will be even more potentially political in nature. But you're right, there's two stated objectives here. One is obviously about Ukraine. Zelensky is there. The president met with him this morning in a bilateral meeting, and he is trying to keep the alliance, the West, together in continuing to support Ukraine. The president apologized this morning to Zelensky for not providing aid faster. Obviously, that was tied up in congressional negotiations. But so there's that element of this trip of reminding the world that we are at another moment. He's saying similar to World War II, where the world needs to stay together to protect democracy. But as you said, there's also those references to the fight for democracy in other places, not explicitly mentioning Trump, but that is an underlying theme of the president's re-election message, that Trump represents an existential threat to American democracy, and where else but Normandy to try to hammer home that point. Also, the clear contrast with Trump, who went to Normandy as president, but did not go to that cemetery and, reportedly made those comments about American veterans being suckers and losers. We've heard President Biden use that phrase many times since those comments came out to express outrage about President Trump. I would be surprised to hear the president use President Trump's name today in France. He is an institutionalist who believes politics stops at the water's edge, but I would not be surprised to hear a little bit more aggression from Biden about the threats, not just abroad, but also at home.
See, this is how good you are, Tyler. You, in that answer, took care of my next three questions. So it was really incredible to see all of the European leaders plus President Biden there at Normandy. One of the things that's being talked about here at home is a piece by McKay Coppins interviewing European leaders and their fear of a second Trump presidency. Any murmurings or rumblings out of Normandy yesterday when they were all together about those leaders turning to President Biden and asking, like, hey, dude, are you democracy good in America?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a striking moment, and it reminds me of when the president made his first international trip to the United Kingdom for the initial G7 when we were still in that post-pandemic, or really at the in that pandemic moment. people had just started getting vaccinated, and he made that first trip. And Biden tells this story where leaders came up to him and said, "Is America really back?" And he said, "Look, we're here. We're recommitted to the world stage, to these alliances." And now, a few years later, that is an open question once again, as the American people are going to head to the polls in a few months and decide between two leaders with starkly different visions of America's engagement around the world. I think we will see more of those conversations next week when the president returns abroad to Italy for the G7 meeting. I'll be accompanying him there, and he'll be having more bilateral meetings with some of those world leaders. I think most of the focus this week is on the commemoration of the 80th anniversary and that imagery of these, World War II veterans, many of whom are over the age of 100, returning to this historic site. And I think that's the focus right now, but it's definitely the undercurrent of much of what's happening around the world. And of course, the UK is having elections on July 4th. So all of these world leaders are grappling with the fallout of these international events domestically as well. And so it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out next week at the G7.
Yes, the G7, which will be in Apulia, Italy, and I am jealous, excuse me, of anybody who gets to go to anywhere in Italy for any amount of time. So I hope you try to have a little bit of fun while covering the president. Meanwhile, back here at home, Tyler, President Biden's son, excuse me, Hunter Biden, is on trial, accused of making 2 false statements and filling out paperwork to purchase a weapon, specifically when he claimed not to be addicted or using illegal drugs. This trial is expected to stretch into next week. How has President Biden navigated this?
Yeah, it's really a remarkable scene playing out in Wilmington, Delaware, where we have many colleagues who are covering the day in and day out of the trial. I was up there on Monday. And it's really a family saga playing out in a courtroom where the president's son is the defendant, obviously, but his ex-wife, his brother's widow, and then his ex-girlfriend are testifying against him. Every day, members of the Biden family have been there. In fact, First Lady Jill Biden attended the first few days of the trial, flew out to France to attend the commemoration of D-Day, flew back to Wilmington, where she's expected may have already arrived in court today, and then going back to Paris tomorrow to attend the state dinner there in France with the president. They're both expected to return to Delaware this weekend. So it's clearly weighing on the first family, the president and the first lady, and many of the other family members extended that have been in the courtroom each day to support Hunter. The president is very close to his son, we've reported, and he's very worried about his son, particularly as a recovering addict who is seeing his ex-wife, his ex-girlfriend, all of these people testify about a time in his life when he was abusing drugs and alcohol. How this trial unfolds in terms of what the ultimate verdict is, I think we're still waiting to see the defense make its arguments and call witnesses to the stand today and possibly into next week. But it's really quite a remarkable moment to see this family's drama spilled out in a courtroom as the president is trying to, do his job and run for re-election. It's quite a moment.
Also, in an interview with ABC News, the president said, when asked if he would pardon Hunter Biden if he were found guilty, the president said no. One more question for you, Tyler. The Biden administration the president announced new immigration restrictions that fellow Democrats have called cruel. What do you make of the timing of this announcement? What's President Biden's goal here? Real quick.
Yeah, look, this is an issue that is hugely important in the presidential election. Immigration is one of the issues voters rank as most important to them as they are deciding who they're going to support, Trump versus Biden. And Trump has made his career on being extremely tough on immigration, threatening to build a wall, which he never accomplished doing, but having very harsh rhetoric and policy toward immigrants. And this is an issue that Democrats in Biden's orbit worry Trump has an advantage on. But it is clear that this is splitting the party. The timing of this is that Biden tried to put forth a bipartisan immigration package on the Hill. It did not receive enough support. The Democrats have tried to go on offensive on this issue, which they're usually on defense, being criticized for being too open, allowing too many migrants to come into the country. And I think this is Biden trying to get out in front of that, saying, look, I put a proposal on the Hill. It had some bipartisan support. Republicans killed it, and now I need to take this into my own hand. But it is worrisome for some of the people on the left side, the left flank of the party, who fear that this could depress turnout or fracture the coalition, particularly among younger voters, communities of color that are critical to Biden's path to victory. And so we're seeing the fallout of that just in the last few days. But it is clear that Democrats feel, especially in Biden's orbit, that they need to be more aggressive on this issue, and they need to at least make up ground on this issue when you look at polls and see that Trump clearly has a higher approval rating than Biden does on this very important issue for voters.
Tyler Pager, Washington Post White House reporter, thank you, as always, for coming to First Look. Have a good weekend.
Thanks so much, Jonathan.
Time for the Opinions Roundtable, so let's go to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find Washington Post columnists Megan McArdle and Danielle Allen. Megan, Danielle, welcome back to First Look.
Nice. Thanks to see you, Jonathan.
So, Danielle, Donald Trump and Republicans say that the Justice Department has been weaponized against them by the Biden Justice Department. Does that hold water when the president's son, Hunter Biden, and Bob Menendez, a prominent Democratic senator, are being prosecuted by the Biden Justice Department?
I think at this point we are seeing a Justice Department that's pretty active with regard to cases, in all domains of our society. So, no, I don't think it's fair to say the Justice Department is being weaponized in a partisan manner. That said, I do think a lot of us are watching and seeing a continuing pattern of excessive criminalization. And I think that's a challenge for our public conversation right now.
Mm-hmm. And Megan, does Hunter's trial impact his father at all politically? And what do you make of the president saying in that interview with ABC News that if Hunter were found guilty, that he would not pardon him?
I mean, I think he's going to say that. Whether it's true, we don't know. Right? He's certainly going to say that before the election. No, look, I'm not saying that in a mean way. If I were the president of the United States and my remaining son, who had had a really hard time, was convicted and faced prison time, I would be tempted. Right? That's kind of the hallmark of a decent person, is to at least be tempted to do what you can for your son. So I think that there is a chance that it happens anyway. I think this is going to impact Biden in the sense that it is going to distract him from other things. But do I think politically this matters very much? I doubt it. I think voters are very capable of separating someone's children from them. And, for all of the Republican attempts, no one has ever successfully connected Hunter's various foreign adventures to Biden. And I think that is the only thing that would actually potentially make a difference.
Donald Trump and his campaign have been pretty quiet as Hunter Biden's trial has progressed. Are you surprised by that, Megan?
I am actually not that surprised, again, because I think Trump, whatever you think of him, has actually a kind of very good sense of what the electorate cares about. And I don't think the electorate cares that Joe Biden had a criminal kid, especially because these are crimes. Look, you shouldn't you shouldn't be smoking crack cocaine every 15 minutes. You definitely shouldn't be carrying a firearm while you do it. But I don't think that the public is desperately worried that Hunter Biden was in possession of a gun and maybe lied on a form to get a gun, especially Republicans, right? They're not big gun controllers. So who are you exactly trying to sway with the information that the president's son did something that was illegal, but that didn't actually result in anyone except Hunter Biden getting hurt?
Interesting. So Danielle, for the past several months, Donald Trump has repeatedly suggested his political opponents may face prosecution, including in an interview Tuesday when he said, and I'm quoting, "It's a terrible, terrible path that they're leading us to, and it's very possible that it's going to have to happen to them." Danielle, is that a threat or a promise?
Well, Donald Trump has been making threats for the entirety of his time in public life. He threatened journalists. He was always rousing crowds in chants about Hillary of lock her up, lock her up. So we know that this is a consistent part of his pattern of practice. The question really is this real this time? And would he take action? I think he is taking moves, making plans to reorganize the Justice Department, other aspects of the civil service and our federal agencies in ways that do suggest he would actually take action this time. So I think it is a threat we have to take seriously. It's not just bluster. That's really the important question at this point.
What do you think, Megan?
Well, I mean, I think actually it points to something about the legitimacy of at least things like the Bragg trial, the Letitia James action in New York State, which is that people who were cheering on these prosecutions, the civil action, were very excited about this verdict. When Trump said, well, this might happen to a Democrat, suddenly that's a big threat. And I think that tells you something about how legitimate these actions actually are. I think it's extremely unfortunate, the Bragg case, in part because I think that some of these actions are very serious, things like the Florida document case, things like the Georgia case, and that there is a sense in which any progressive prosecutor who had any potential to bring any sort of action against Trump at all did. And that is a blow at the legitimacy of the system in exactly the way that we're worried about Trump doing when he says things like maybe this has to happen to them. And I think this would be a good moment for everyone to stop and reflect about where this is taking us. And, I almost never say Trump has a point, but he kind of has a point here, that this really is a dangerous place that we're going. And I understand the desire to see Trump. I do not like Donald Trump. I am not voting for him. But there are good ways and bad ways to get rid of him. And what has happened in New York State is a bad way.
Danielle, wait, does Trump have a point? I mean, I take issue with a lot of things Megan just said, but I would love to get your reaction to what Megan said.
Well, I do think we have a challenging moment where we need a reset, and we're going to have to think about reestablishing the credibility and legitimacy of our justice system. It is under a lot of pressure and under a lot of critique from all sides, and honestly, we have to recognize that the critiques are coming from all sides. We really do face, the conversation about the Supreme Court, as well as this conversation about the charges against Trump. Credibility for our legal system, our justice system, is being undermined. So we have work to do to rectify that. With regard to the various Trump cases, I do think there's a challenge in the sense that some of them are much more significant than others of them. And I actually agree with the sort of general sense that I would have been happier in a world where the most important cases were the ones that had legs and were moving forward, and the ones that were really showing us, again, that sort of excessive reach of the law were not moving forward.
Speaking of the election interference case, I'm thinking of the one in Georgia, Megan. That one was put on pause. The same is true of the election interference case in Florida. I'm just wondering, is it fair to the American people that these trials most likely won't take place before the November election?
Look, I think you have to ask, why were these cases only finally brought in an election year in the first place? These are for offenses that happened years ago. The federal offense is a little more understandable, but look, the prosecutors did not push to get these done before the election. They pushed to get them done in 2024. And again, I think this goes to, while I think these are strong cases that should be adjudicated. I think, honestly, no Republican forced Fani Willis to hire someone she was having an affair with. No Republican forced Jack Smith and Merrick Garland to slow walk the federal cases. These are actually decisions that were made by Democratic appointees or Democratic electees. And I think that, this is, again, a problem with, I agree that no man is above the law. Trump should be prosecuted for the things that are serious crimes that he did. But the appearance of politicization on multiple levels, or just the appearance of, in Fani Willis's case, extraordinarily poor judgment. I think that is actually not on, Trump. That is actually on the justice system.
Just a point of clarification: Fulton County DA Fani Willis. Her issues are personal, has nothing to do with has nothing to do with the actual case she brought against the former president.
I agree with that, precisely because it was an important case. To have had the enormously poor judgment to muddy this case and slow it down with her personal relationships, It's horrible that that happened, but that's actually on her. It's not on Donald Trump.
Danielle, did you? I think I cut you off trying to jump in there. If not, no. Okay, so we'll move on to Democrats being divided over President Biden's. This is for you, Danielle. President Biden's immigration executive order that's aimed at limiting the number of migrant crossings at the border. But some congressional Democrats are saying it goes too far. What are your thoughts?
Well, we definitely need, again, this is another area where we need a very significant reset. Immigration policy requires attention. The Republican Congress blocked an important potential bipartisan agreement to address the situation. So I do think, yes, the president had to act. We have to consider this a first act, not the end of the conversation. I think that's the important thing here. So yes, we do also need to do further work. I'm not sure exactly where the path is to that immigration reform compromise that we so desperately need, but it remains an urgent political priority.
Mm-hmm. There was a question I forgot to ask about, Donald Trump and his cases, but I would love to get your reaction, and I'm going to come back to it, but I would love to get your reaction to the president's immigration executive order, Megan.
Look, I think that this was going to happen because it had to happen politically. Joe Biden, I think, made a mistake not prioritizing getting control of the border earlier in his presidency. It is now very late, and he is having to take drastic action in order to try to regain some ground on an issue that really favors Donald Trump. That said, I think the bigger picture is that there are deep challenges to the asylum system globally right now. For years it worked, but it was always kind of inherently gameable if you showed up and made a spurious asylum claim and the system's overwhelmed, and that means you get to work in the United States or in Europe for years while your claim is adjudicated. And I think that in a deeper way, I'm really concerned that if we don't find some way to stem the flow, that what is ultimately is going to happen is the collapse of the right of refugees and asylum seekers to try to find safety in other countries when something goes deeply wrong at home.
Danielle, is it fair to say that the president waited too late to do something about this and is taking drastic action when earlier this year we watched the most conservative immigration reform bill ever to be negotiated in Congress, with the lead negotiator being one of the most conservative members of the Senate, Senator Langford, get shot down because Donald Trump said to Republicans, don't pass it because I don't want Biden to have a win?
Yeah, no, that's what I was referring to. So thanks for spelling that out in more detail. And that is exactly the moment where, yes, I mean, we were on the cusp of actually having a compromise, a bipartisan compromise to move us forward in our immigration conversation. It's desperately needed. It's a policy area that has been suffering from polarization for, at this point, almost 2 decades, where we keep continuously getting quite close to actually achieving a compromise of some sort that lets us rethink people with temporary work visas and the like, rethink the asylum process, draw on good and effective models around asylum from Canada and the like, but we are not able to get those compromises through because of polarization. And here, once again, partisan advantage was put ahead of the good of the country. That's what happened in Congress when Trump put his sort of thumbs down on that. And so now Biden has to act. Again, the lateness, I think, the blame for the lateness should be well distributed. It's not by any means Biden's fault for the lateness.
We didn't, I'm just realizing we didn't even talk about what's happening now over in France. Yesterday, the 80th anniversary of D-Day. The president, any minute now, will be speaking. Actually, it's supposed to be about 10 a.m. Eastern. Will be speaking at Pointe du Hoc, talking more about the heroism of D-Day. I would love to have each of you, Megan, you go first. Thoughts about, it's been 80 years. And a lot of the things that, those GIs stormed those beaches for and died for are still front burner 80 years later.
I think it is remarkable to think of, the line, it's not really a new line, but, that resonated with me from the speech is freedom is not free. These men paid with their lives, with crippling injuries for the rest of their life, with the astonishing bravery of coming out of these little tin boats and running through the ocean towards the guns. Um, and they bought us for a long time a more peaceful and democratic world. And I think that we do have to, as we look back, we need to recommit in the face of some of these threats of, we thought we were done with the Soviet Union, but we've got an expansionist Russia, we've now got an expansionist China. And we as Americans are going to have to recommit to doing what it takes, paying the price to spread more freedom and more democracy throughout the world, as well as, of course, maintaining it here at home.
And Danielle, I would love to get your thoughts, but in watching the ceremony, I'm always moved here in Washington when I see veterans on the National Mall, particularly at the Lincoln Memorial. And when I see one with World War II veteran, and I don't see as many of them as I used to when I first moved here 17 years ago, I would always make a point of going over to at least one of them and just saying thank you. And watching the ceremony yesterday, seeing I saw at least 2 African American World War II veterans, and when they were given the French Legion of Honor, the first one, I don't know, I teared up through the whole thing, but especially watching that Black man, thinking about the fact that he left a country that treated him as a second-class citizen. He fought on behalf of that country, survived that invasion only to go home to Lord knows what kind of treatment he got when he returned home from his hero's fight. Your reaction and reflections on the 80th anniversary of D-Day.
Well, yes. I mean, it is powerful to see the veterans there returning to the place of the incredible sacrifice that they made. And, I went and reread the Reagan speech because, of course, everybody's thinking about that right now. And the Reagan speech is so powerful because he over and over again says, you did it, you did it, you did it. And it's really that recognition that the most important things, the work of living free and fighting for freedom, is something that ordinary people do. And it really isn't actually about a big plan or the administration. It's we do it, you do it. That's such an important message. And I think Megan is right. I mean, this is a moment for recommitment to the project, the hard work of living free. The thing I would add, though, is that there's also actually an incredibly important difference between 80 years ago and now. As our conversation has been proceeding, we've been sort of hitting one after another kind of pillar of society that is crumbling or shaken or weak in some fashion. The justice system, the immigration system, what we're watching with Ukraine, what we're watching in the Middle East and so forth is also the sort of global structure for stability quaking. So it's not that we have exactly the same fight as we had before. We have a new set of challenges. We are living in a time of incredible turbulence. So the spiritual commitment to the project of living free, that needs renewal. But the answers to how we achieve it are going to be different. And so that's the thing I sort of worry a bit about. Are we ready for the very powerful acts of imagination and forward looking that are necessary for us to meet the challenges of this current moment?
Mm-hmm. And as President Biden likes to say in many of his speeches, and I'm paraphrasing, that America is more than a nation, it is an idea. For the first time in human history, a nation brought together by an idea. Megan McArdle, Danielle Allen, thank you both very much for coming back to First Look. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for watching. For more of these important conversations, sign up for a Washington Post subscription. Get a free trial by visiting what you see there on the screen. I like doing this. WashingtonPost.com/live. That's WashingtonPost.com/live. Once again, I'm Jonathan Capehart. Thank you for watching Washington Post Live's First Look.